Good evening. Good Friday evening to all of you, and welcome to the University of Texas at Tyler, the 5th annual Darwin Day. My name is Amir Mimran. I have the pleasure of serving as the provost at UT Tyler on behalf of the organizing committee of this Darwin Day at Tyler. Uh, our folks in biology department, our colleagues in the Tyler Junior College, we're delighted to host you tonight. We have a great program for you. But I wanted to remind us all of what this day is. If I look up the International Darwin Day, they actually on the website, they say it is a day to celebrate perpetual curiosity, hunger for truth, and intellectual bravery. Actually, Tuesday, February 12th, would be the 210th birthday of Charles Darwin. So I thought it would be good for me to just give you two quotes from Charles Darwin that I believe they have as much relevance today as ever. First one, it says, "It's not the strongest of the species that survive, nor the most intelligent, but the one most responsive to change." The second one, it says, "Ignorance most frequently begets confidence than does knowledge. It is those who know little, not those who know much, so positively assert that this or that problem will never be solved by science." So that's why I think this would be really more about promoting science and celebrating science as it is about celebrating the life and the accomplishments of a scientist. I want to take a moment and recognize our colleagues from the Department of Biology who put this program together, especially Josh Banta, the director of the Center for Biodiversity and Ecology and Environment, and Lance Williams, the chair of our Department of Biology. We're very fortunate to have a very good biology department with close to 400 undergraduate and 20 graduate students, $1.8 million of funding, and various areas of research from ecology to biology. They cover everything. And actually the center has 19 faculty members from 3 colleges and 5 different departments that work on various areas of biology and ecology that is very, very important to all of us. So without further ado, I also want to brag about the fact, in fact, I was talking earlier today that this department is the first one that we have an NSF Career Awardee in Dr. John Seal, and also we have a Fulbright Scholar in this department. Again, another bragging point for our Department of Biology, and I wanted to make sure I recognize them. But I want to ask Dr. Banta to join me and introduce the speaker. As I said, we have a great program, and we're delighted to have you tonight. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Dr. Mirmaran, and thank you all for coming to the second of the 2 main events of our Darwin Day celebration for Tyler, Texas. Darwin Day events are timed to coincide with evolutionary biologist Charles Darwin's birthday on February 12th. He was born in 1809. Similar events are held annually worldwide, and the purpose is recognizing the benefits of scientific exploration and discovery, focusing on evolutionary biology and biological diversity as well. Events commemorating Charles Darwin's contributions to science have been going on since his death in 1882. But Darwin Day in its modern form, as you see here, traces back to the 1990s. Darwin Day has been commemorated in Tyler, Texas for about 9 years by the Center for Earth and Space Science Education at Tyler Junior College. And it's been a joint venture of UT Tyler and Tyler Junior College for the last 5 years, with events spanning both campuses. Darwin Day in Tyler, Texas has grown into a multi-day series of events with partners and sponsors locally at UT Tyler, Tyler Junior College, the Discovery Science Place, the Ingenuity Center, the Center for Earth and Space Science Education, the Alpha Chi Honor Society, and funding from the National Science Foundation. The events include public science lectures, such as this one, moderated videos about evolution, and activity booths at UT Tyler and the Discovery Science Place. There will be an activity booth for families tomorrow at the Discovery Science Place. Regular admission fees apply. I want to make sure to acknowledge the growing list of organizers that we have for our Darwin Day Tyler event. So if you are here when I call out your name, please stand and be recognized. So our organizers at Tyler Junior College, we have Tom Hooten. Tom, yeah. Betsy Ott. Doug Parsons. Doug, are you here? No, okay. Danielle Pritchard. And then we have Chris Razier from the Discovery Science Place. Chris, if you're here, there we are. All right, awesome. And from UT Tyler, we have Alex Matthews, Sarah Senula, John Seal, here you go, Katrine Kellner, Brent Bill, it's a growing list, and then from the Robert Muntz Library at UT Tyler, we have Rebecca Fernandez and Christine Forisha. I should also point out that there's a display about Darwin Day at the library that includes books about evolution and features some of Dr. Glaze's peer-reviewed journal articles, our speaker this evening. And then also the biology department graduate students at UT Tyler and UT Tyler organizations like the Biologists of Tyler, Texas and the Tri Beta Undergraduate Honor Society have been pivotal in volunteering and putting together a bunch of the events. This evening, I have the distinct pleasure of introducing Dr. Amanda Glaze, who is giving her second public science lecture at Darwin Day Tyler 2019. Her first public science lecture was yesterday evening at Tyler Junior College. Dr. Glaze is an assistant professor of education at Georgia Southern University. She received her bachelor's as well as her education specialist and master of education degrees at Jacksonville State University in Jacksonville, Alabama. And she received her PhD in curriculum and instruction at the University of Alabama, specializing in science education. Dr. Glaze has also taught for 5 years at the middle and high school levels as a science teacher in Alabama and Georgia before pursuing her academic career. And so she uses her wealth of knowledge of students' perception of evolution and its place in the field of science to study approaches for improving science literacy. In addition to her many peer-reviewed journal articles, including one I should point out that came out just this week in Nature, Ecology, and Evolution, Dr. Glaze has been featured in or quoted by several media outlets, including NPR, Newsweek, Scientific American, and she was awarded the Evolution Education Award by the National Association of Biology Teachers in 2018. And she has worked with and spoken at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. And I should also mention that she has modules for teachers available about how to teach evolution, and those are through the Smithsonian's Human Origins website. Without further ado, I will hand the baton over to Dr. Glaze.
Thank you so much. Making sure that I'm turned on and not too terribly loud. Thank you all for coming tonight. I'm really excited to be here in Tyler, Texas, and I get really excited to talk about Darwin and talk about evolution anytime I get the opportunity. One of the things that I highly focus on in my research, and I realize I'm really loud, is the intersections of science and society, specifically how we have conversations with people when it relates to issues where the public sees controversy. Now, I think we can all agree that in the scientific community, there is no controversy surrounding evolution. We know that evolution is one of the most widely supported evidentiary theories in all of science. And it not only unifies the studies in biology that we conduct, but it unifies across fields with our understanding of just how big of an impact evolution has and just how important those observations and that thinking by Charles Darwin 100 years ago really impacts us today. But one of the things that we see a lot in society is where faith, where beliefs, where culture and science come together, we get a major disconnect. And that's something that has been largely impacting scientific literacy in this country for many decades. So I'd like to share with you a little bit about my research and what I do with that herein. Aha. We'll get back to that. Okay, so there's a delay. I love this quote. There are only two bequests we can hope to leave our children with, and one of those is roots and one of those is wings. This matters in my research because what we find is that a lot of times the roots that we hold on to, where we come from, has a great impact on how we view science, really on how we view everything, every experience, everything we learn in a classroom, every conversation. It all comes back to the roots that we come from. But often the approach that we take when we're teaching science in the classroom, or when we're having a conversation with someone in class or out on the street, takes a very different approach. We tend to look at people as being devoid of information, as being empty vessels waiting for us to impart them with the evidence for them to understand. But yet what we find when we come into conversations about evolution is that there is a very rich dynamic that comes into play. Not only am I talking to you when I mention, oh, well, what about this amazing thing that Charles Darwin said? Or, oh, it's descent with modification. That has to process through everything that you have experienced in your lifetime. And where that intersects with your beliefs, where that intersects with your culture, we have a lot of different things that happen. If they line up, you're good with it. You accept it. You grow, you keep moving forward. But where those come into conflict is where we find the most issue. This is where we get contention. This is where we get rejection. A lot of people ask me how I came into this line of research. I'm actually trained in evolutionary biology as well as in science education. And as I was telling people last night, I actually came into this through a mixed background of my own. Aha. I grew up in a very devout Southern Baptist family in very rural Alabama. And I actually heard evolution for the first time in 10th grade when my teacher refused to talk about it. Now, being the good young student that I was, I immediately flipped to that part of the book and read every bit of it that I could. Now, that's not the typical response when somebody says, this is horrible, I don't accept it, we're not going to talk about it in class, but I was lucky that I took that step. And as a result of taking that step and then trying to go home and talk to my church community and my family about it, I suddenly became aware of this very deep divide in what I saw as a very logical explanation of things happening as described by my textbook and what I was being told by the people that I trusted and loved the most in my life. And it was a very difficult thing to go through. But I'm glad I went through that, because without that, I would have never had the context when I became a biologist and I became a teacher to look beyond the concept of, I'm just going to give you more information and everything's going to be okay. It challenged me to look deeper and to take my own experiences in my culture and apply them to what I was seeing in my interactions with others. In a framework done in 2010, Christy Bowman looked at students all over the country to look at what they were learning in the terms of evolution and biology. Now, this is a legal study, so it took a very interesting turn. But what she found was that students in the South are 84% less likely than anywhere else in the country to receive any instruction on evolution, and then 10 times more likely to get none at all. So a majority of students that were coming out of the South in the last decade and going into universities were either not taught evolution, or they were inaccurately taught, or taught bits and pieces. So a lot of focus has come on the South as a hinge point for understanding how people teach and learn as it relates to evolution. And it's very important that we do these studies because we have this wonderful thing called worldview and significance of place. And if you think about it, it makes sense. We don't necessarily want to divide people, but if you go around the country, you'll find natural pockets that exist where there's a shared undercurrent of culture that is so much greater and more powerful across a whole than just in a small community. And Southern culture represents this on a wide scale because Southern culture is steeped in fundamental Christian belief systems and the idea of church as community. It's not just a place you go. It's not just a hat that you put on and take off. For many of you who grew up in the South, anybody raise your hand who grew up in the South? Have you heard the concept of church family? Yes? What about the idea that if you played sports, it happened in church, right? If you were in clubs, they were connected to church. I was Southern Baptist, RAs, GAs, Awana. Sound familiar? If you go to camp, it's a church camp. On Wednesdays, you go to church, you have dinner, you have services. I see a lot of people nodding, yes. On Sunday, we had 3 services. You come in the morning, you come back to eat, then you come at night, right? And so it becomes very much a part of the fabric of community. Your friends are at church. Your family members are at church. Your sports teams are at church. But yet you go to school and you're expected to divest yourself of all of that as you're learning about new things that sometimes come in direct conflict with what you're told by your roots. Now, worldview is very important, and we find that in these regions, just like in the South, there tends to be a very widespread shared worldview. People of different colors, different backgrounds, different genders, different creeds, all moving together because of regional undercurrents of culture that exist. I started asking myself, why is this a problem for some of us to talk about, but for others it's not? And I thought, I'm curious. I'm also kind of nosy and lack social cues. So I just started asking people, well, when did you hear about evolution? What did you think about it? And I received responses such as this one. Evolution was looked at like it was ridiculous. Like you were unintelligent if you could actually believe that people came from monkeys. We're not even going to talk about the misconceptions in that, right? But how many of you have heard something like this if you've mentioned evolution to somebody? Raise your hand if you've heard, oh, it's just a theory, right? Raise your hand if most people think that the only knowledge we have of evolution came from Charles Darwin. 100 and some odd years past that, but we'll let it go for now. But these are the comments that people make in that context of conversation. Things like, I came home in 5th grade excited about something I heard about in science class, and my mom told me to wipe that devil out of my mouth. Terrified. We do not discuss that in this house. When your teacher talks about that, you get up and you walk out. I was a classroom teacher for 5 years. I had students get up and walk out of my class when I talked about evolution because they were so ingrained with what they had been taught that it was evil, that the purpose of evolution, the purpose of science was to disprove the existence of God, and therefore they did not want to hear it. But nobody's talking to them about that. What they're getting is someone coming in and saying, oh, you don't believe this? You just don't know. Let me tell you how ignorant you are and impart upon you my wisdom, and you're just going to take in what I think. Well, let me tell you something, and I said this last night. Hi, my name is Dr. Amanda Glaze, and I don't believe in evolution, and neither should any of you. Evolution is not a matter of belief. Belief is reserved for faith. Evolution is a matter of acceptance based on physical evidence of a physical phenomena in a natural world. We cannot test for the presence or absence of God in science, nor do we try to. We cannot consider anything metaphysical or supernatural. And yet, if you walk out in the streets on a Sunday afternoon and you ask people about evolution, one of the biggest fears that people have posited to me over a decade of community conversations has been, science just wants to prove that God is not real. No, I'm pretty sure we're not. I'm relatively certain nobody has sent that into science or nature at any point ever. But that's what people think. They don't understand the significance of place, and they don't understand what it is that scientists even do. And so there's a starting point for our conversations about how do we get a scientifically literate society when there are elements that are the absolute framework of all sciences, the underpinning framework of the entirety of science, not just biology, the unifying theory, but yet a majority of our population says, no, it's not real. On the other side of that, as someone coming from an evangelical, literalist, young earth creationist background, there is the idea that to even entertain something other than that background is to completely turn your back on your faith. It's not a matter of what I like and what I don't like. It's a matter of something that is very real, a very visceral gut reaction, a fear. I can tell you in my evangelical tradition, hell is real. The devil is not a metaphor. And therefore, to consider something that would challenge my beliefs is imperiling my mortal soul. Gives you a little bit more of a context for a conversation with someone when they say, I'm a believer, I can't talk about that. This is the 21st century, but evolution in the United States, evolution in the southern United States, evolution in college classrooms, evolution in K-12 classrooms is every bit the traditional definition of taboo. There is a legitimate fear of evolution that is tangible, that is real, and has the same power as the dark had on our ancestors in ancient times. It moves people to that level. I love this quote, and I think it's wonderful that the provost mentioned it, that it's not the strongest that survive, it is the one that is most open to change. I point this out because it's interesting to me that as much as we talk about change and as much as we embrace change and as much as science loves that it is self-correcting and never satisfied, that we have been very unwilling to change our views on talking to people about evolution for generations. We find the same thing happening in science classrooms where we are lecturing people on evidence and lecturing people on evidence. And what happens? Nothing. Gallup has a poll that has literally been running for 30 some odd years, looking at where people fall nationally as it relates to their ideas about evolution, whether they accept evolution, whether they reject it, whether they have a theistic view of it. We have not moved the mark in 32 years. How many people in here are teachers or professors? Please raise your hand. If you had a test that you were given to your students, and for 32 years nobody passed it, would you continue to give that test? Hopefully you wouldn't make it 32 years, right? But you wouldn't continue to give that test. That would be something that you would walk away from. You would revisit. You would ask yourself, okay, what am I doing wrong? But yet we still approach the problem with the exact same hypothesis. We don't change our method, but yet we expect to magically get a different response. I talked to you tonight about the intersections of science and faith because it's important. Regardless of where you come from, regardless of your culture, regardless of your religious choice, regardless of your background, your race, your gender, your creed, anything, it is important that everyone is scientifically literate. But for so long, we have put the focus on science versus religion. There was a debate not too long ago, Ken Ham and Bill Nye. Science versus religion. And what does it amount to? Two people on far ends of a system preaching to the choir, yelling at their echo chambers, their position. But what about everybody else? Do you think any minds were changed listening to that debate? Not likely. Because it's not a matter of one versus the other. It's a false dichotomy. You do not have to be an atheist to be a scientist. You do not have to give up your beliefs to love science or to practice science. You can be both. You can be all of it. In the research that I do on evolution, I focused very heavily on teachers. And the reason for that is that our teachers are the front lines in the conversation about evolution. A majority of people in this country will not go beyond K-12. So if we have a majority of teachers that are afraid to teach evolution or are teaching evolution and the nature of science inaccurately, that represents a national level problem. But what we find is that a lot of times the opportunities to work with teachers, to mitigate these conversations, to help them get comfortable in teaching evolution do not exist. They are terrified of the idea that students will be harmed by what they teach, whether that's harmed in their faith or whether that's a conflict being caused. They're afraid that parents are going to challenge their teaching even before it ever happens to them. This is widespread. It's interesting to know that if you actually look at the acceptance rates of evolution among first-tier nations, there's only one other country that scored as poorly as we did among all first-tier nations in the world, and that's Turkey. The United States and Turkey have the lowest rates of acceptance of evolution among all first-tier nations in the entire world. And a lot of that has to do with our fear of bringing culture into the conversation. Now, let me say, I do not advocate for teaching the controversy. I do not advocate for teaching intelligent design or alternative theories. Science has its place in the science classroom, period. Other things have their place, but those are places by choice that occur in the home. But it also means we can't just ignore that culture is a factor. Each one of you brings into this room tonight a worldview that is part of who you are. It is your identity. And that comes from your culture and your family and your friends and the beliefs and experiences that you have accumulated over a lifetime. And those things do matter. And if we ignore those in a conversation, even about the concept of evolution, we're doing a disservice to your understanding. I think it just doesn't like me. Aha. So I told you earlier, I don't believe in evolution. And that matters. Evolution is not a religion. Evolution is a scientific concept based on evidence. Beliefs are a matter of faith. They're different ways of knowing. We make the assumption that people who don't accept evolution are ignorant of the facts. But in reality, the research tells us quite the opposite. that there are a lot of people that are willingly accepting of evolution who know very little about it. There are a lot of people who know very great deal about evolution who actively choose to reject it. I was telling the grad students earlier today, with photosynthesis, you just look at it. You go in a lab, you can see this happening, you can see the chloroplast working, we can study all the mechanisms and cycles, we know all the formulas, and the more you see it, the more likely you are to say, oh, okay, this is real, this is happening. But wait, we've got the same thing with evolution. But photosynthesis doesn't conflict with your culture. It doesn't conflict with your background. You've never heard a preacher stand up and rail against photosynthesis. Your mother has never told you photosynthesis is not an appropriate conversation for the dinner table. Right? So the semantics matter. Understanding worldview matters. Understanding what science is and is not. It all matters. So we have to take this into account when we start talking to people about evolution. I tell people all the time, the best advice I can give anybody for any topic is shut up and listen. Seek first to understand, then to be understood. Before you can combat a problem, before you can talk to your students about something that to them may be actually viscerally scary, you have to know where they're coming from and actually take the time to understand and feel that with them and realize, is it a matter of understanding? Do they just not know the evidence? Or is it something deeper? And how can I create a space to have that conversation in a way that doesn't step on your beliefs, in a way that doesn't walk in the door setting the woods on fire, saying, well, your whole family lied to you, your preacher's a liar, I just think it's this and you should ignore that. No, that's not how that works. But yet that's what happens on a regular basis in classrooms around the country, regardless of level. I mentioned the statistics a minute ago for the Gallup poll, if it'll pull up. Maybe I should stand on this side. There we go. This is nationally through Gallup, 32 years of polling. And what we have at this point in time is a range of 45% of the country aligns to a creationist view when it comes to evolution. In other words, evolution does not occur. Rejection of evolution. Almost half of the population. Fewer than 20% of the population views evolution through a biological-only standpoint. Another mid-range has a blend of the two. But a lot of times in classrooms, we don't respect that blend. We don't allow that blend to exist. And we don't think about the fact that a majority of people are coming in with worldviews that may or may not align to our own, may or may not align to what we consider a scientifically founded worldview. But I'll say this, our goal in science education is not to destroy the worldviews that are coming into our classroom, but rather it is to take every worldview out there and help build into it a scientific worldview, that appreciation, that curiosity, that interest, that fact that we are never satisfied with the answer. There's always more questions. I started out my research looking at pre-service teachers because I wanted to know what's going on. You know, do they know what they're talking about? Do they understand what science is? Do they accept evolution? But it kind of grew and grew and grew and took on this life of its own until the point that it became a national undergraduate study. 111 institutions representing every state in the United States and Puerto Rico, with more than 20,000 data points for students who are undergraduates, both majors and non-majors. And I wanted to know, you know, what's going on with this? What's going on with the knowledge, with the acceptance? You know, where are we failing? So I'm going to put some of the background information while I talk about this. But it's been very powerful for me to look at this nationally and then look at it regionally and see that, you know what? The assumptions we make about the South, while they are true, we are not alone because this is a national issue. It's a national issue. We're not doing enough for our students to really understand evolution, to make them comfortable, or for our teachers to prepare them to do this as well. There we go. So at a national level, acceptance of evolution is 72%. That doesn't mean 72% of students accept evolution. That means people only partially accept evolution. So if you look at this as a test score out of 100, people are scoring in the 70s. That means I'm cherry picking the parts that I like and don't like to accept. Most people you ask are absolutely fine with things evolving as long as they're not humans or changing into other species. But when we look at content knowledge, and these are university students, 43. Think of that as a test out of 100. And the national average of basic high school evolution concepts. We're not even talking about getting into the nth degree information. We're talking about voyage of the beagle, bottleneck, genetic drift kind of questions, 43% nationally. Nature of science understanding. What is science? 46%. The really bad news, it's not any better for majors than it is for non-majors. They're within a 5-point range of each other across all scores. Terrifying much? And these are our future scientists, our future doctors, our future teachers, our future everything. But yet we assume that knowledge is going to impact understanding. Now regionally, look at this. We actually did a little better as a region when it comes to content knowledge and understanding of NOS than the national. But we have a much lower acceptance, and that ties into our worldview. We have a deeper cultural underpinning. Comparing pre-service teachers to undergrad students, with the exception of teachers seem to know more about what science is and isn't than biologists do, which is weird. We see very similar scores, but we see less evolution content. You know why? Because teacher education doesn't require training in evolution. And it's often left out intentionally when people have an option of which biology courses to take. The other problem is, for many students, the only exposure they get to evolution happens in introductory biology, which may take course over a week unless they have someone that integrates it throughout. And we at the college level tend to assume that people who make it to college have a basic understanding of the things they choose to major in, which may not be quite the correct assumption because we don't know what they're coming in with. But we just learned that 84% less likely to get accurate instruction and 10 times less likely to even hear about it other than we're not talking about it. Critical assumptions are being made that are perpetuating this issue. So what does this mean? Hands down, across my research community, we see evolution education as the single greatest failing in science education today. The single greatest failure of science education. Because we have a theory that is representative of every field in science. It is the underpinning theory of all of biological science. And yet that is the part that we can't get our heads around. That is the part that people are actively rejecting. That is what people are saying, oh, it's a hoax. Oh, scientists are just lying to us. Oh, it's just a theory. It's a critical failing. We know that grade school experiences are weak if they're happening at all. But yet, we don't take the opportunities to get beyond the lecture when we get them as undergraduates. We wait until they're in their upper level courses or even graduate studies before we start giving them opportunities and requiring them to dig into evolutionary coursework and analysis. Even professional level students have this problem. Professors, you may want to cover your ears because this is probably going to hurt your feelings. I did a study on professors as well, and their nature of science scores were actually pretty low. You know why? Because nobody's teaching us the nature and history and philosophy of science. Very rare to find that in program requirements. And so as a result of that, we perpetuate things like the scientific method, which, by the way, is not a thing. I'm sorry, your teachers lied to you. There is no single scientific method. It's a farce. Because every scientist has a very different methodology, and different fields look at things different ways. And empirical testing is not always a thing that we do. There is no one set of steps that every scientist religiously, magically follows. What does happen is it has to be replicable and it has to stand up to peer review. But the way we approach it is very different. But people don't understand that. People think that science is about proof. They think that laws are elevated theories once it's been proven. Anybody remember being taught that in school? I was actually taught that. It wasn't until much later that I learned that theories are where the power falls in science, that the law is just the what is happening. The theory is all the evidence and exploration and understanding that explains how it happens. Theories are the power of science. And we find that worldview is coming into play in our classroom. And that if we don't give opportunities to talk about the fact that there are scientific ways of knowing, there are religious and philosophical ways of knowing, that we don't talk about the fact that God is not a factor in science because we can't empirically test for the presence of God or the absence of God in a scientific explanation. So what do people come to class with? What they've heard on Twitter or Facebook or on a podcast they watch, or their friend Joe, who they think is a guru on something, who really knows nothing, right? But we don't create a space to talk about that. And that's where we get our problems. So what do? We have to stop as scientists looking at everything from a lens of us versus them. We have to stop as scientists thinking about the problem being one of lack of knowledge and start actually talking to people about our science. What is science? How do we do our science? We always talk about the evidence, but we don't give people a comfortable space to look at how the evidence is intersecting with their culture, with their ideas. We don't talk to people about what makes them comfortable in learning. We come in the door and we tell people, today we're going to learn science. We're not going to talk about your beliefs because your beliefs have no place here. Oh, well, that's fine. Let me just take all that off and I'll set it over here and we'll have a conversation. Or we walk in the door and we tell people, your beliefs are wrong. You're now going to listen to what I say, and this is right, and you need to change your thinking. Now, I don't know about you, but somebody comes in the door like that at me, I'm going to shut down. I'm not going to listen. If I hear somebody come in and say that to somebody else, I'm going to shut down. I'm not going to listen because I'm going to think that person's a jerk. My goal is not to preach at the people that are on the far side of either end of the option. I know the people that already accept evolution, they're good. That's great. Great day. We'll talk about the evidence. We'll have good conversations. I know that there are going to be people on the far other side that God himself would have to come down and say, yes, evolution is a thing, and then they'll be okay with it. I'm not going to yell at them either. My goal is the middle ground, because a majority of people in this country could fall either way in their understanding based solely on the interactions that they have with other people. And for me, other people means me. How I talk to people, listening to how they feel, listening to their experiences, and using that information to create a place where people that can't go home and talk about evolution with their friends and family can come to my office and feel comfortable saying, look, I know what you said in class today, but I was told this growing up, and knowing that they're not going to get laughed at, that they're not going to get shut down, that they're not going to get told that that's ridiculous, and planting a seed of curiosity. So that's what I challenge you to do in your conversations with people. If you're a science person, when you're talking to others, take time to listen and really understand and put yourself in that person's shoes before you start having that conversation. Because my goal is science literacy. It's not to win an argument of evolution versus beliefs. It's not to win that argument, because in essence, when I win that argument, I really lose. Because the person I'm cowling down is not going to change their thinking, is not going to embrace science as a welcoming thing, is not going to want to be scientifically literate. And that person is voting and making scientific decisions, or maybe the next politician or doctor or lawyer or nurse. And I have the opportunity to be the person that turns them on to science and welcome them into science and be a listening ear that helps build that for them. And that's all of us. We may never have the platforms that Neil deGrasse Tyson and Dawkins and people like that have, but we have a lot more personal interactions with the people around us that matter. And so I challenge you to take that up as your mantle, to plant that seed of curiosity by being willing to listen and take that into account, because we find that the biggest factor that impacts changes in acceptance of evolution is not how much evidence you share. It's the conversations that we have surrounding our culture and understanding. Nature of science and creating an open space for people to ask questions. That's the variable that literally changes the playing field. So if you take nothing away today except for my quote from the beginning, we want to give our children roots and wings. Roots so that you never forget where you come from. That connection to your worldview, your culture, to use your experiences and learn from the experience of others. But then to take that and channel that into wings to fly. Asking questions, being a voice for science, being a representative of what you have learned and what you have experienced. And I hope that that is what you will take with you, not only from my research, which is very personal to me as someone that made that transition on my own, but being a difference maker and being someone that stands for science in an era where science denialism is higher than it's ever been. I just want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to share a little bit of my journey and my research with you tonight. Anyone have any questions?
All right, I've got the microphone that I'll pass to you.
Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
So the obvious question to me is, how is Thanksgiving in the Glaze household now?
It's actually, I tell people my family tolerated me for a while. My family is fantastic, actually. They have been very patient with me, even though they didn't understand. I told people last night, actually, when they found out I was researching evolution, they kind of panicked. My grandmother wrote me a 13-page letter, handwritten, because she honestly thought that I would burn in hell and she would never see me again in the life after this one. And, you know, I know some people kind of giggle at that, and everybody has their own position, but to an evangelical Southern Baptist grandmother, that is like the absolute most horrible thought she could ever have. I mean, she cried and cried and cried, and it was horrifying to her that I would be studying evolution. Now, I will say this, that over time and sitting down and talking to her about my position, and especially because she realized after a nature of science talk, you know, Mama, science doesn't try to prove or disprove God. We can't study God. If we could, he wouldn't be God. So, you know, there. She was okay. Before she passed away in 2016, she was okay with my research and very supportive. And she actually came to a point where she would tell people that that's my testimony. And, you know, for her, that was very powerful, that I'm the person or one of the people trying to bridge the gaps between people of faith and people of science, because you can be all of the above. As the years have passed, and I've been doing this for more than a decade now, I get text messages from my parents, you know, asking me questions about things that they see in the news and wanting to have conversations. My dad texted me the other day. She's like, okay, so tell me about this Lucy thing, you know, because there was something about the, you know, the fossils in the news. And I was like, oh, he asked me. And so getting to have conversations about evolution adjacently, and now getting into human evolution, and we talk about beliefs and literalist traditions and things like that. So it's really become powerful. It's taken time, but I didn't push them, and I didn't try to shove it down their throat. I didn't walk in the door. I'm like, evolutionist, you know. It's been an amazing journey. In fact, my mom drove from Alabama to hear me speak for the first time this week, y'all. So she's right there. So it's really been transformative, and I think as much for me as it has been for them. So the she was asking how curriculum standards support the teaching of evolution at the lower levels. If you look at the next gen science standards, evolution starts in K1. The idea is that we expose students to concepts when they are most open and curious. I mean, you take a kid, I mean, I've got 4. You take a kid, you stick them in front of all kinds of things. Say the basic homologies lab, right? Whale, hand, bat wing. You put that in front of them and you ask them, what's alike? They will pick up on it like that. That natural curiosity hasn't been beaten out of them yet, right? And so it's there at the earliest standpoint. And a lot of teachers fall back on the existence of evolution standards as their reasoning when people do challenge them. The thing is, even though national standards exist and state standards exist, and some are really strong, some are not so much. I know Alabama, we didn't say the word evolution until 2016. But there's so much autonomy in the classroom. That's where we end up with teachers opting not to take it. And our AP scores, I actually just released a study on this last week. Our AP scores struggle in the life sciences nationally because evolution is a huge part of the national curriculum, but so much of it is not taught or avoided that people aren't scoring highly enough on the test for it to matter. So the curriculum support is there, but a lot of times the fear overpowers the fact that that is what's dictated in the curriculum. And then don't get me started on the massive swath of legislation that's come out in the last 5 years in many states pushing academic freedom and alternative theories and whatnot. So it's there. Yes. Run.
So I've always been really fascinated with evolution.
Mm-hmm.
And when you were explaining your situation growing up, I could relate to it almost word for word. And a lot of times I think about, because I come from a really religious household,
Mm-hmm.
and my parents still think that I'm in that mindset. And a lot of times I think about how I'm going to sit down with my parents and tell them
Mm-hmm.
that I just don't buy it.
Mm-hmm.
It's just not my belief. And I'm curious, how did you talked about your relationship with your family, but how did you originally let your parents know that you just weren't on that side anymore?
So I actually am in between sides. So I revisited my beliefs, but I'm still a Christian. So I'm no longer a literalist creationist, but I still believe in God. So but that still was a hard conversation. I never really sat them down and said, hey, I don't quite line up with this, and this. But we've had tidbits of conversation, really, I think over the years, where I would sit down and talk about, well, this is what our dogma said. And this is what the scientific evidence says. And this is the context. I'll tell you, I went through like a major crisis, identity crisis, because of the conflict between my understandings of science and my background. And I dove headfirst into theology and religious studies, world religions, science, a little bit of everything, and recrafted my thinking based on all of that. But yeah, as far as, just sitting them down and saying, hey, we never really went there, I don't think. It was, even when I was going through it, I think I more kept it to myself, like kind of like what you're talking, it's like, I don't want to really have that conversation. It's only as I've gotten older that we started having bits of conversation about where I fall now.
So you never tried to rationalize it with them. You just said, this was sort of where I stand now, and this is just how it's going to be.
Yeah, because one of the things that happens in anything with, I think, any kind of identity issue is you are who you are, and your beliefs are what they are. And your parents may never be really accepting of that, and I think that was the big scare factor. And I think that's the scare factor with a lot of people and things. You have to decide, is this a conversation that I even need to have with them? Because is it for your benefit, or is it because you want them to see, it's a long, very long conversation, but it can be very hard. It took a lot of years before I was clear enough on my own thinking to be able to start having those conversations with them.
Thank you.
Sorry. Wish I had a great,
No,
wonderful,
that's
life-saving answer for that, but.
I was just interested in how.
Yes. Slowly. Slow change over time. Sorry. I was told not to tell jokes. I couldn't help myself.
Hi.
I
just have a question. Don't you find that there are some writers and people who the Christian community does look up to, scientists that, you can bring that in? C.S. Lewis is considered one of the greatest,
Francis Collins.
Exactly.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And I find that so helpful, because
Mm-hmm.
you're not trying to say it's, these are my beliefs,
Right.
and this is science.
Mm-hmm.
To me, they're totally not mutually exclusive at
Right.
all. There's beautiful
Right.
harmony there. But, there are people who've written about
Yes.
this for decades.
Mm-hmm.
And, I find that it's so annoying. And so,
Right.
them versus us to make it that way. It doesn't have to be that way.
I think the separation of things scares people so much they want to absolutist it.
Mm-hmm.
We were actually talking today about Jeannie Scott from the National Center of Science Education and some of these other people who explicitly say, I am Jewish, I am Christian, I am, Episcopal, I am Muslim, I am whatever, and I am a scientist, and I accept evolution, and I have my beliefs. I think there should be more of that. And the resources that Dr. Banta was actually talking about with Human Origins, that's exactly how we approach the teaching of evolution and what we're training teachers to do in their classroom. It's called the culturally responsive strategy. And it takes from the Dalai Lama, it takes from all different religious traditions and philosophical traditions, so it doesn't target any one group. And it talks students through the concept of different ways of knowing. That you can have scientific ways of knowing and religious ways of knowing and philosophical ways of knowing, and they're all valuable at different ways in our lives. But they conceptualize this idea that it's this or this. And, in reality, 99% of things, there's no black and white. It's mostly gray area. But you're absolutely right. There is power in that. And we don't do that enough.
Well, and even for a teacher that may not be a Christian, having those
Mm-hmm.
things at your disposal
Yes.
because that would be what I would assume would be like the biggest,
Mhm.
fight
Absolutely.
that would come into the classroom.
Yes.
And saying, you know what, C.S. Lewis,
Mhm.
read Mere Christianity. He talks about it a lot. And
Mhm.
just Francis Collins, just like you said. I mean,
Exactly.
there's so many people out there who
Mhm.
explain it very well and probably would open up that door
Yes.
for them. So,
You are 110% right.
So I wrote this question down when you were talking about the scientific method because it kind of really struck my interest. It seems like in almost every biology course that I've taken throughout my life, the scientific method has been a part of the introductory materials or the methods that have been taught to us as students to understand how scientific testing works. So my question is, if there's no scientific method, why are doctorate level professors emphasizing this method onto us so much?
So there is no single scientific method. There are commonalities across all sciences. But for example, every time I go out in the field, I'm not doing empirical studies with treatments and controlled variables and independent variables and so forth. A lot of what we do in science is observation. There's not this neat little set of steps where we magically have a question and then we start hypothesizing. It's usually a very messy construct. I think all the science people in here will agree. It's very rarely this nice little cut and dried, now we have results. Now we analyze. Now we draw a conclusion. It's like, no, that just blew up. We're wrong. Oh, okay, let's go back over here. Somebody collect more data. Where are the fish? It's messy. Yes, I know my fish people are like, yeah, oh my God, yes. It's so much more messy. So the funny thing about the scientific method is, I think it was in the 1920s, a scientist was being interviewed by one of the big New York magazines about what he did. And he actually described what he called the scientific method. And it ran in this big national magazine. And bam, it was everywhere. And it has been in textbooks ever since. And we have been arguing ever since that there is no one single method. Now, it does provide a decent model of one form of very neatly done, how it never works, science that's easy for people to conceptualize as a model. But it's not cut and dried like that. It's not that pretty. It never works that well because it's never, this beautiful linear pathway. But
Thank
yes,
you.
You're welcome. That freaks out my students too, so.
that just makes me happy.
I know, right? It's like, it's not just me.
It's not just me. I hate it.
Okay, so I know you had said like a lot of the times if you bring up evolution, people will normally just say, oh, so you believe that we evolved from apes.
Mhm.
And you had said that your approach to things, you don't like to shove information or evidence down their throats. So like, how do you bring about that conversation to make them like help them understand that, just kind of like your viewpoint on things?
So when I talk to people about evolution, I usually talk to them about their experiences first, because that helps me identify prior knowledge, where are they coming from with this. It helps me identify misconceptions that they have that I can specifically talk about, that's not just assuming that they don't know anything about evolution. And then I'm also kind of trying to look and see if they're just trolling me, because that exists too. Because there's some people it's a reciprocal argument over and over no matter what you say. But when I say not shoving evidence down people, I just mean literally not coming up and saying, look, I know what you believe, but check that at the door, because that's not scientific, and so it doesn't exist. Or I've actually heard people tell people they're wrong. Your beliefs are wrong. This is science. Science tells us facts. What you're talking about is fiction. Great way to start a conversation, by the way. But, you can talk about the evidence, but I always lead in by talking about the misconceptions first, because sometimes you don't even have to get to the evidence. The simple fact of, oh, wait, what? So I've had theory wrong this whole time? Yeah. Is enough to break through that they will start asking me questions. And plus, people know where I come from. I'm kind of loud, and talk like a Southern Baptist minister, but that's kind of part of my upbringing. I should have warned y'all about that first. But yeah, but yeah, I mean, it's in a lot of ways, it's just like speaking. You know your audience, you get to know them, and then you let them ask you questions, and it's a different comfort level. Now, in a classroom, I'll come in and I literally teach my students about the nature of science explicitly. I start every semester very in depth about scientific misconceptions and nature of science. If I have them take a quiz on it to see where they fall, because people are usually really confident in how they think about science, especially if they're science majors. And then you get a few questions in and they're like, oh, I don't know. You know, they're questioning themselves because they aren't sure or aren't as certain about it as they thought they were. And so I have not had any issues since I started doing that when I get to evolution. And I mean, I teach in South Georgia. So, you know, a lot of my kids come from the same background I came from. And a lot of them have had the same negative experiences hearing about it. And most of them have never had a course on evolution. But it really greases the rails, so to speak, to open that conversation without just coming in the door and saying, you're wrong, I'm right, listen up. So that's what I mean by shoving it down their throats. I saw another hand somewhere. Yes. You want to? You're getting some exercise.
Oh, yeah. The questions are never clustered.
They're doing it on purpose. I paid them beforehand.
So
I can't hear over the band.
Just hold it real close. Yeah, no, it's working. You just got to hold it real close.
oh, okay.
Yeah.
So I know that you stated earlier that based on your upbringing
Mhm.
and your own curiosity, it made you kind of the middle ground for both religion and evolution.
Mhm.
But I was wondering, how do you deal or how do you relate both sides of the story that conflict each other or oppose each other, like evolution versus how God said he created Adam and Eve? Because those don't add up or go hand in hand.
So my thing with beliefs is that I don't impart my integrations on other people. I am more of a stop and listen, because even as someone who is middle ground between the two, it's not my job to construct an integrated belief system for anyone. And there are a lot of different ways that people cope. For me, a lot of what I do, because I'm a bench scientist as well, is what I classify as cognitive apartheid. So I have my scientific ways of knowing here. You know, when I'm writing, researching, publishing, I'm not considering God as a factor in my research. But then personally, I have my own way of taking the pieces of my faith and my beliefs and what I've learned and experienced and where they fit in with my science. Now, to me, Discovery Institute embodies the idea that everyone should be taught one way of how things integrate together. I don't advocate for that. Beliefs are personal. Each person, even if everybody came up in the same church, same upbringing, everybody is going to have different interpretations and feelings about that. And so that's actually something I never talk about to other people, is how I personally handle and think through that, because I don't want my thinking to be the foundation of theirs. So sorry, I know that's kind of a non-answer, but you know, that's I guess my personal space, and I want people to be able to think for themselves and develop that for themselves, because it is so personal and individual.
All right, I see two more hands, so we'll just do two more questions.
I'm telling you, they're doing it on purpose.
They are. They're pinning the corners of the room here.
Dr. Glaze, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
We kind of have a question or a concern, or see if it's if it's a shared concern. While I can understand the short-term gratification of teaching kind of a amicable, concurrent existence between science and faith, especially in the context of biological evolution, to try to establish some middle ground and reach some more commonality. Do you have concerns that long-term that'll just further ingrain ramifications of cop-outs that we commonly see, like the God of the gaps theories, that any part of science or scientific ignorance that we have yet to discover is constantly, said, well, that's God, and that by allowing these two things to at least from a soft stance seem that they can work together and not taking a firmer stance on it, that we will proliferate those types of ingrainments in the future that'll obviously cause us some backlash and hinder progress down the road.
Unpopular opinion incoming. It's not my business what other people elect in their faith and their beliefs. What matters to me is they understand science, regardless of whatever else. Now, I understand what you're saying, and I'm very familiar with God and the gaps and so forth and so on. Do I think it's a slippery slope? No, because I also don't think it's my place to dictate to any of you whether or not you integrate your beliefs and your science, or whether you choose to cognitively separate them or mix them together. That is not my place. That is no more my place than it's my place to dictate to somebody what their identity is, because worldview and beliefs and faith are a part of personal identity. So, as far as that goes, that's one of the things that I really have major issue with, researchers like Richard Dawkins about, is the idea that, it's a slippery slope to let religion still exist. That's not my call. Religion serves an evolutionary purpose just like everything else.
Thank you.
Yes.
All right, we'll take one last question I see up here at the front.
Okay, so I have two questions. I go around campus and interview students on various topics. The first question is, would you be willing to conduct an interview anytime that you're free?
Yes.
Also, the second question is, do you believe in universal truth?
Universal truth is a matter of philosophy, not of science. Science is not, we do not deal in absolutes. So as far as absolute truth, that's not my realm.
So do you believe that 2 + 2 is 4 for everyone everywhere, or do you believe that it's different?
Okay, so that's math, not science.
Okay, it's true.
But my point is with this is that in science, we're not dealing in truths. Truths are a matter of philosophy. One of the quotes that I put up frequently is that in philosophy, we deal with absolutism. In beliefs, we deal with absolutism and truths. The entire nature of science is based on uncertainty. It is based on the fact that we are self-correcting. We never prove anything 100%, because the minute we say that we have absolute truth, we stop asking questions and we stop looking. And so when it relates in science, we're not in the business of truths and proofs. But yes, you can interview me later. And we can talk in a minute. So thank you all so much for coming. I think I'm over time.
Yeah.
But if you have other questions that didn't get asked, please feel free to email me or catch me on Twitter or anything else. I'm happy to answer questions, to talk to people, share my research, etc.
We tried to distract you. We tried to distract you, Dr. Glaze, by having a band play right outside the door, and it didn't work. So kudos to you. Yeah, right.